Hello. Thanks for coming, everyone. It's nice that it's a nice day. So my name's Sasha. I'm a lecturer in film practice and theory in the department. This is my third academic year here. And in a way, I and other practice tutors kind of embody the way that the department combines theory and practice, in that I am a filmmaker originally. I've been making films for about 10 years. And then I did a PhD, and I have kind of an academic research practice alongside my film practice, and they really speak to each other. And that's really how we approach teaching practice as well. So not only do you take modules that are film history and theory, and then on the side take modules that are practice, but the practice modules in themselves will always combine history and theory with practice specific to that particular type of work, and vice versa. Some of the theory modules, for example, the visual essay one, will have some of the assessments be done not in essay form, but in film form. So we really try to integrate the two together through everything that we do. So this is supposed to be a taster session, in that I'll just do a little kind of flavor of what one of the classes might be like. But first, I think it's also just interesting to speak a little bit more about what types of practice courses we teach and how that goes. So across the 3 years, these are the main practice modules that are available. As Guy had mentioned, in first year, if you're a single honor student, both the practice modules are compulsory. And then beyond that, it becomes increasingly optional. And we find that students, after having tried it, often discover that what they came in with in terms of thinking like, I want to be a filmmaker, and then when they try it, they realize that actually they enjoy writing a lot more and focus on theory and not do a practice module again for the rest of the degree. Or completely vice versa, someone comes into the film studies degree because they're just really interested in film and thought that if they're going to do a humanities degree, why not this one? And after doing production techniques in year one, realize that they really have an eye for filmmaking, and then fill as much of their optional modules, which can be around up to half every year, with practice, and then go into filmmaking. And so there's a lot of flexibility around this, and there's a lot of kind of room to make your own path as the years progress. In the production techniques module, you're introduced to all the kind of fundamentals that you would need from a technical side to be able to go out and make a film by yourself. So you learn camera, lenses, lighting, sound, editing, other types of post-production, also some of the kind of basic blocking techniques for shooting with actors and narrative work, and you make a short film in teams together. And then in year two, as Guy had mentioned, script writing has a kind of higher level module that you can take. And then there's directing fiction and the documentary modules, and you can take both or either. There's no kind of limit on how much practice you take. And I teach the documentary module, which I'll be speaking about in more detail in a moment. And then in final year, there's quite a lot of different things. And again, you're kind of at liberty to take all of them if that's what's interesting to you, and you end up producing quite a lot of quite substantial work, which you can then go on to submit to festivals, have in your portfolio if you want to apply for work in film, etc. Forms of film practice, as Guy also mentioned, introduces much more kind of non-standard avant-garde approaches to filmmaking. So you will have already established key techniques in both fiction and documentary, although my documentary approaches definitely include some experimental vibes as well. But forms of film practice really expands that. Feature film development is a writing module that again takes the script writing to the next level, where you spend a semester developing a treatment for a full feature film, which again people go on to try and get sold and produced further down the line when they finish. In creative production, you work in the production team, and that's an important kind of difference between this and, for example, the dissertation by film practice. So in creative production, you work as a team to make a very accomplished narrative short film, where each of the team members takes on a different kind of film position, right? So this is kind of where you have an opportunity to really specialize. Someone directs, but someone's a cinematographer, someone's an editor, someone's a producer, and you kind of really fully explore what that role entails. And in dissertation by film practice, which I also teach, each student makes their individual film project, and this module runs over the course of the year, and you're completely at liberty to get other people to help you with production. But a big part of it is really thinking of how filmmaking can be research in its own way. So you kind of enter it with a research proposal and some research questions that you try and answer through the making of the film. And this year was actually the first year that we ran it, and it was really popular and went really well. Despite all the restrictions, people made some really incredible work. So there's a number of different methods that we use in teaching practice. So they include lecture screening and seminars, just like your regular theory modules, right? So even on a practice module, some of the first sessions or throughout, depending, every one of them is quite different in their structure. You would often have lectures, discussions. But then what kind of happens alongside that and throughout are technical workshops, right, where you're really just like trained in the meat of the techniques and what you need to know, practically speaking. Individual tutorials with the tutors who are all themselves accomplished filmmakers, films and projects that you're doing, and you get feedback at every stage of, from development, going into production, going into post-production, looking at rough cuts, etc. Group critiques, also in different modules at different stages, but often at every one of those stages, all the different students come together and everyone shares where they're at with their project. And these are always really dynamic and really kind of, people really learn from each other and hearing how relatable all the different challenges are that everyone is facing. And then finally, the modules kind of culminate often in an event where all the different work that had been made on the module is screened. And this is always really exciting because the work that students manage to make in such a short amount of time is often really stellar. And those of the pieces that are particularly strong really kind of motivate the rest of the group in their future semesters and years to bring it. And then the types of skills that you learn. And in a way, a lot of this happens even if you just take one or two of the modules. But then, of course, the more of them that you take, the more you really hone these skills. So again, like I mentioned, all the key film techniques from camera lighting, cinematography, sound recording and mixing, film editing and sound design, post-production, which includes, color correction, special effects, etc. Film development and script writing, again, across all kinds of different module levels and different lengths of the pieces. Directing actors on the second year module for directing, you're really taught the kind of craft of what it means to direct actors and work with them, right? So not only think about what's in the script or how you're going to shoot it, which is huge, but also like how do you get a good performance out of somebody? How do you create chemistry between people? Documentary production, which includes, again, many different types of aspects, from knowing how to catch a moment if you're just doing like an observational fly on a wall type of thing, or knowing how to get something interesting out of an interview if you're doing something interview based, and really kind of getting into the real kind of details and craft of every aspect of it. And last but not least, kind of broad project management and teamwork skills. As you can imagine, making any kind of film often means bringing all manner of resources and logistical questions and creative questions and people and their different needs, kind of having to make that all coalesce into something that really works, and that can be really challenging. And the skills that you build there and through making a successful production kind of come together, and that being skills that are very useful and applicable completely outside of film production in the world of work down the line, right? So people often go into something event-based on this basis. So for example, the second year module, Documentary Theory and Practice, that I teach, that I'll talk about in a bit more detail as a kind of sample of what practice modules might be like. This one probably more so than some of the others, is split into theory and practice really perfectly in half. And because this is the very first real introduction to nonfiction that the students get in second year, because prior to this, things would have focused kind of more broadly on narrative film history. So we kind of really start with like the really fundamental questions of, what is a documentary? Not an easy question to answer, you will find. And when does it emerge? And what are the conditions of that? And how does something get called a documentary? And then we kind of look at it, because time is limited, rather than looking at different periods or kind of national contexts, we look at it through these really key kind of conceptual issues that have been a big part of documentary from the very start and until present day. And with every single film that you make, these questions are relevant, but they also kind of neatly stack up into some kind of relatively historically linear form. So we look at documentary truth, which I'll also talk about in slightly more detail shortly. And yeah, I'll talk about that. We look at documentary ethics. As you can imagine, working with real subjects comes with really kind of important ethical questions. And at different moments in documentary history, what was considered to be good practice was very different. And at the moment, different types of documentaries will have different approaches. But broadly speaking, it's understood that you have an ethical responsibility to your subjects who you're working with. You have an ethical responsibility to your audience, insofar as not misleading them deliberately. But you also have an ethical responsibility to like the film and your artistic process, right? And following what actually is good for the film. And different types of people will prioritize different ones of those at expense of each other sometimes, in very different ways. So that's something that we explore historically. Then we look at documentary techniques, and all the different types of working of documentaries that exist, from expository to essay film to observational, reflexive, participatory, etc. We look at documentary form, so really kind of engaging with like the meat of the filmmaking art of it, and the kind of semiotic things that come together and being able to tell a story visually specifically, never losing sight of the fact that film is a visual medium, and it's about how something is framed and how one shot follows another shot that the story really comes together. And then we look at decolonial practices, and so like really contemporary approaches that try to undo certain histories of exoticizing gazes. And this year we had quite a big event around it that went beyond the module. We had a salon where staff and students from other years could attend, and we talked about this question quite broadly, and we also had a visiting artist. And then after the reading week, all of what we've learned is then kind of transferred into the students having to devise and produce a project of their own. And it's such a short amount of time, and I was really blown away this year what people managed to come up with. If we have time, maybe we won't have time, but there's, I think, a link available to one of the really amazing films that people have made. And so what happens is as many people as have ideas pitch a film that they have an idea to make, and people who are interested in collaborating in that kind of join them. And there's 40 people on the modules, and it was in the first kind of half taught in 3 seminar groups of around, I guess, 12, 15 people. And then there was, I think, overall 15 films that were being made in roughly groups of 3. And it really kind of naturally divided into the right number as people proposed what they'd like to do and people joined them. And then we had a really kind of rigorous schedule where we met individually with each group to talk about their idea, talk about how they're going to film it, who they're going to film it with, what equipment will they use, what will be their formal kind of visual approach, what questions will they ask, why. All the rest of it, then they went out and did production, and we kind of supported them in this. And then again, we had individual tutorials with every group to talk about how they're going to put it together, what have they shot, what have they missed, how do you start a film, how do you end a film, how do you build an arc in 3 minutes. Then there was some time for post-production, and then we had a final screening and critique. And even though the films are kind of finished by that point, the critique that everyone gets from their peers, again, they can take into their further years. So very, very briefly, just a few ideas that we covered in week 2, documentary and truth. So in the first week, when talking about what is a documentary, we covered the first few decades and the first few decades of the 20th century, for that matter, of documentary history. And in the second week on documentary and truth, we kind of kick it off from the post-World War II era and begin with the observational documentary schools of direct cinema in the US and cinema verite in Europe. And it's really important in general, I think, to the way that we teach to think about film and the development of different forms in relation to the development of social history, but also very much in relation to the development of technological history. So from the vantage point of us, each having a portable camera with us at all time, we might take it for granted that you would record sound at the same time as we record image, or that you'd be able to hold the camera in your hands. But that was new at that point. Portable cameras were developed actually during the war in order to be able to document it. And as the industry emerged into the post-war period, the availability on the one hand, portable equipment that meant that you could shoot really fast and react to things, the availability of sync sound that was brand new, and also importantly, the availability of fast film, which is to say film that's very sensitive to light. That meant that you could shoot without additional lighting, which was necessary in most conditions prior to that, meant that this totally new kind of way of filmmaking has emerged that became really concerned with a kind of purity of truth and objectivity in capturing events as they happen. So the key principles of direct cinema is directness and immediacy, no tripods, no lights, no rehearsals, no staging, no narration, no interviewing. And as you can imagine, all the reasons these specific things are listed is because they were what documentaries were made of just before. And again, a lot of this type of stuff became very influential over the decades that follow, and it might seem really familiar to us, but it was extremely new and unfamiliar at that particular moment. I think we don't probably have time to watch things, but the important thing is that even as it's happening, and even as all these kind of manifestos are written about the importance and centrality of truth and all the different specific ways that you could get to it through filmmaking, at the same time, the very people who are involved in it are also being kind of reticent about even the possibility of truth and cinema of any kind coexisting. So here's a nice quote from a French filmmaker, Georges Franjou, who says, "There isn't any cinema verite. It's necessarily a lie from the moment the director intervenes, or it isn't cinema at all." And so there's this thing of how can it, the very precondition of it being a film, right? That at some point someone decided to start rolling and then to stop, and then perhaps to cut different images in the sequence with other different images. The way that something was framed, even if it's handheld, even if it's decided in the moment, those are all decisions that had been made. And so mediation is at the heart of filmmaking. And so it's incompatible with some kind of absolute objectivity. So I'm just going to skip a couple of these things. Am I 20 minutes? Okay, well, you know what? What can you do? Importantly, as the 20th century progresses, in every cultural sphere in the 80s and 90s in particular, postmodernism begins to take hold with its aspects of reflexivity and citationality. And while in the mid-20th century there was all these debates of what's the best way to get at the truth, in the later 20th century the debate turns to all the different ways to explore how truth is unattainable, and how documentary is always about the porousness. Documentary and fiction also, I guess, is always about the porousness of fiction and nonfiction, and exploring that in kind of new and creative ways. I'm just going to skip through a bunch of this. So then ultimately when we get to setting the task of the film for the students, and all of these kinds of debates that have taken place for a number of weeks, is it's kind of asked that they're reflected in the way that people come up with what they want to make a film about and how they want to make it, and the way that they present their process, and then ultimately in the final essay that they write about their film in the context of documentary history. All of these things are involved. So I guess I'm out of time.
Yeah, there's questions here. Will that film play? Would you like to say about it?
Yeah, if I click. Oh yeah, perfect. So this is a film that was made this year by a group of 3 students in like 4 weeks.
Have you ever felt pressured to change something about yourself for the pleasure of a man?
Personally speaking, I would say that yes, such as, for example, the pressure for shaving or maintaining a low body weight.
Yeah, my whole body, so it fits in with specific beauty standards, which 9 times out of 10 are dictated by men.
I find it interesting how a lot of the times in school when we're talking about the world and we talk about its natural beauty and how it sustains itself and these geometrical patterns that just sort of exist, and then they say, you know, how does this exist without a god? There has to be a male gendered entity there to have created all these things, and there's no way that the earth can exist by itself without some kind of craftsmanship. It sort of becomes like an artist-muse relationship, I suppose, and quite ironic that the earth as woman is constantly sort of denied her ownership to her own creativity and her own productivity.
Yeah, it is crazy how entire laws are formed on the basis of forcing somebody to give birth to a child despite of their own will.
The question is, why do men get to choose what happens to women? Especially when it comes to decisions about their bodies, what rights do they personally have to make those choices for us? We are literally the victims of our own work, of our own success as some people would view it. Yeah, great, we have so much technology, computers, transport, we can fly, but we are damaging the core thing that gave us the resources to achieve all of this in the first place.
If we didn't mine for fossil fuels, we'd have to change the entire structure of society.
Well, the people who are in charge of these big decisions are all people who will be dead before big environmental crises actually take over and impact human life.
We often say that we are destroying the earth, but in fact what we are doing is destroying our own capacity to inhabit it. We consciously refrain from using words that refer to our own potential of extinction and rather present the earth as a passive victim. The funny part is that earth will find a new equilibrium. It is us who are in danger of extinction.
Well, my last relationship ended with him saying we could keep going, but only if you change things about your body that I don't like.
It is impressive to think about how somebody is so well aware of the power that they are allowed to have over you, that they essentially are able to say that I will still be with you if you change yourself for me. Often such kind of comments are not only directed towards the body of a person, but also the energy of a person.
It's infuriating. It's manipulating the way you perceive yourself. It's kind of like a vicious cycle where it doesn't just stop there. It goes on. It's like a dark cloud that will just remain.
Literally, yeah. It is a dark cloud.
Yeah. So keep in mind that this was made in like the deepest moment of lockdown. So they couldn't, go out and shoot things. They couldn't interview people. So they opted for working with found footage and a conversation they had with each other, and incredibly animation as well, and really managed to pull it together in this really powerful piece.
I haven't seen that one before. Brilliant. It's really nice that we've closed on a piece of student work, because that really foregrounds why we do what we do, to allow that kind of really wonderful work to happen and facilitate it.